I looked my son straight in the eye and warned him, one more word from your wife about my life savings, and we are going to have a serious problem. I gave her a housewarming gift, not permission to touch my money. Do you understand? Mark shifted his weight, staring down at his sneakers. He mumbled a vague apology, rubbing the back of his neck. He always did that when he was caught between his wife's demands and reality. The trouble had started 3 weeks earlier, right after they closed on their new 4-bedroom suburban home. I had driven over with a fresh batch of blueberry muffins and a card containing a $10,000 check. It was a generous housewarming gift, meant to help them buy appliances or cover the minor repairs every new house needs. I was a widow of 5 years, and my late husband, Tom, had left me comfortable, not yacht wealthy, but secure. We were sitting on their bare living room floor, eating takeout pizza. I reached into my tote bag to grab my reading glasses and accidentally pulled out a folded bank statement I'd been using as a bookmark. It slipped from my fingers and landed right next to Stephanie's paper plate. Before I could retrieve it, her eyes darted down. I watched her pupils dilate. She saw the bottom line of my retirement account, a number that represented 40 years of Tom's hard work and my careful budgeting. She quickly looked away, but the damage was done. The air in the room shifted instantly. Stephanie handed me the paper with a sickly sweet smile, her tone suddenly dripping with a new, highly calculating kind of affection. She thanked me for the $10,000 check, but she wasn't looking at the check anymore. She was looking at me like I was a human piggy bank waiting to be cracked open. I thought my stern warning to Mark that afternoon would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days after the pizza dinner, the subtle comments began. Stephanie started calling me just to chat, which was unusual. Usually, I only heard from her when they needed someone to wait for the cable guy, Kathleen. We were looking at composite decking for the backyard. She mentioned casually over the phone, the sound of keyboard clicking in the background. It's about $20,000, but it adds so much value to the property. We figured since we have that extra cushion now, it's a smart investment. I paused, wiping down my kitchen counter. You have $10,000 from me, Stephanie. And I imagine you need a refrigerator first. Oh. Mark put the appliances on a payment plan. She brushed off my logic completely. I just think family wealth should be utilized to build more equity. Don't you? My retirement fund is for my medical care and living expenses, not backyard decks, I replied flatly, refusing to entertain the concept of family wealth. She let out a high-pitched, dismissive laugh. Of course. Kathleen. Just thinking out loud. When I visited them the following weekend, the atmosphere felt strained. Mark looked exhausted, hauling moving boxes, while Stephanie walked around with a contractor, pointing at perfectly fine hardwood floors that she suddenly found offensive. I sat on a folding chair in the corner, sipping water and observing. She kept loudly referencing our budget to the contractor, glancing in my direction to see if I would volunteer to chip in. I stayed entirely silent. I wasn't going to play her game, nor was I going to let her guilt me into funding a lifestyle they couldn't afford. As I gathered my coat to leave, Stephanie blocked the doorway. We need to sit down this Friday. She smiled, her eyes cold. I've put together a little presentation for the family. Friday evening arrived with pouring rain. I drove to their house, carrying a homemade lasagna, fully prepared for an uncomfortable conversation. I just didn't realize how bold Stephanie was about to be. Dinner was rushed. The moment the plates were cleared, Stephanie pulled a tablet from the kitchen drawer and set it flat on the dining table. Mark looked down, suddenly very interested in a scratch on the wood. Kathleen, Mark and I have been crunching some numbers, Stephanie began, swiping open a color-coded spreadsheet. You live alone in a 4-bedroom house. It requires maintenance, property taxes, and heating. It makes zero financial sense for you to hold on to that much empty space. I rested my hands in my lap. My house is fully paid off. Stephanie, the taxes are manageable, but the equity isn't doing anything, she countered, tapping the screen. Here is the plan. You sell your house. It's a seller's market. You take the equity, pay off our new mortgage, and you can move into our unfinished basement. We can use a portion of your savings to finish it into a nice little mother-in-law suite for you. I stared at the spreadsheet. She had already calculated the estimated sale price of my home down to the dollar. She had factored in the cost of basement drywall. She had completely erased my independence and turned my life's work into a subsidy for her mortgage. And if I need assisted living in 10 years? I asked, quietly, testing her logic. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. She waved a hand dismissively. Family takes care of family. Plus, you'd be here to watch the kids when we eventually have them. It's a win-win. She slid the tablet across the table toward me, genuinely expecting me to agree to hand over my home and my freedom. I gave her something else entirely. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry or ask Mark how he could allow this. I simply stood up, pushed my chair in, and picked up my purse from the counter. I am not selling my home, I stated, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. I am not paying off your mortgage. And I am certainly not moving into a basement to become a live-in nanny. Stephanie's confident smile vanished. Her face flushed red. You're being selfish. Kathleen, you're sitting on $500,000 while your son struggles with a 30-year loan. My son chose to sign that loan. I replied, looking directly at Mark, who still refused to make eye contact. I raised him to pay his own bills. Thank you for dinner. I walked out the front door, the rain instantly soaking my hair. Mark jogged out after me, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. Mom, wait, he pleaded, shivering in the cold. She just wants us all together. You don't have to get mad. Can we just talk about it? There is nothing to discuss. Mark, my finances are no longer a topic of conversation in your house. I unlocked my car and got in. Driving home, I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt a cold, sharp sense of clarity. Stephanie wasn't going to stop. If she had the audacity to suggest taking my entire house, she was going to look for other ways to access my money. I pulled into my garage, turned off the engine, and sat in the dark for a moment. I needed to secure my life. I walked inside, made a pot of decaf coffee, and booted up my computer. I decided to review every single bank statement and credit card account I owned, just in case. My main checking and savings accounts were untouched. No strange transfers. No odd withdrawals. I breathed a sigh of relief, leaning back in my desk chair. Then, I opened the portal for an old credit card I rarely used. It was a card I kept purely for emergencies. 10 years ago. When Mark was in college driving a beat-up sedan, I had added him as an authorized user so he could pay for sudden car repairs or towing. He hadn't used the card in years, but I had never bothered to take his name off the account. Right there, under the Pending Transactions tab, was a charge for $3,200 at a high-end patio furniture retailer. My heart beat a little faster. Mark knew the rule. That card was for emergencies only, and he was a grown man now. He hadn't asked for permission. But as I stared at the screen, a different realization washed over me. Mark was terrified of debt. He hated spending large amounts of money. Stephanie, however, had just been talking about a composite deck and needing furniture for it. She must have found the card in Mark's wallet, or worse, convinced him that it was an emergency to furnish their new backyard before the summer season. A younger, softer version of myself might have called Mark, crying, asking why they would betray my trust. I might have demanded an explanation or expected an apology. But the woman sitting at the desk that night had survived the loss of a husband and the grief of rebuilding a life alone. I didn't have the energy for a screaming match. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't yell at the empty room. I simply closed the laptop, went upstairs, and laid out my clothes for the next morning. I had errands to run. The bank opened at 9 a.m. I was the second person through the glass doors. I sat across from a friendly banker named Luis. I handed him my ID and the emergency credit card. "I need to report this card as compromised," I instructed calmly. "I also need to completely remove the authorized user, Mark, from the account, and issue a new card with a new number sent directly to my P.O. box, not my home address." Luis typed quickly, nodding. "We can decline any pending transactions if you suspect fraud, ma'am. There is a pending charge for patio furniture. Decline it." I confirmed without hesitation and cancel the transaction completely. Once the credit card was secured, I didn't stop there. Stephanie had seen my account numbers on that bank statement. While it was unlikely she could access my retirement funds without my signature, I wasn't taking chances. I spent the next 2 hours opening a new primary checking account, transferring my funds, and closing the old one. I updated my direct deposits and changed all my online banking passwords to completely random strings of letters and numbers. Finally, I went home and gathered all my important financial documents, the deed to my house, Tom's life insurance paperwork, and my will. I drove to the post office and locked them inside a newly rented safe deposit box. By noon, I had built a financial fortress around myself. Stephanie could present all the spreadsheets she wanted. She couldn't touch a single dime. I drove home, made myself a turkey sandwich, and sat on my back porch. All I had to do now was wait for the patio furniture company to process that payment. The phone rang on Thursday afternoon while I was repotting some orchids in the kitchen. The caller ID flashed Mark's name. I wiped the soil from my hands, took a deep breath, and answered. "Mom." Mark's voice was strained, bordering on panic. "Mom, I need you to call your credit card company right now." I kept my tone perfectly neutral. "Why is that?" Mark Stephanie is at the outdoor living center. They're trying to load the patio set onto the delivery truck, but they just ran the card for the final balance and it was declined. The manager is looking at her like she's trying to scam them. She's humiliated. "Did you freeze the account?" "I didn't freeze it," I answered, picking up my trowel to pack more dirt around the orchid roots. "I canceled it. And I removed you as an authorized user." Dead silence on the other end of the line. You canceled it?" he finally stammered. "Mom, why would you do that?" "We needed that patio set for the housewarming party this weekend. You used an emergency medical and auto repair card to buy luxury wicker chairs without asking me," I stated clearly, cutting through his excuses. "That is theft, Mark. I am simply securing my property." Stephanie said, "You wouldn't mind." She said it was part of the housewarming gift. My gift was the $10,000, I reminded him, my voice turning to ice. "Tell your wife she will need to use her own debit card to pay for her furniture." Do not ever try to spend my money again. I hung up the phone and set it on the counter. 30 minutes later, a silver SUV slammed into my driveway, tires screeching against the concrete. I didn't bother locking the front door. I knew she was coming. I poured myself a cup of tea and waited in the living room. Stephanie threw the door open, marching into my foyer with her face blotchy and red. Mark trailed behind her, looking like a scolded child. "How could you do that to me?" Stephanie demanded, dropping her designer purse on my armchair. Do you know how embarrassing that was? The manager threatened to call the police for fraud. I took a slow sip of my tea. It was fraud. Stephanie, you attempted to use a card that didn't belong to you. It's family money, she yelled, stepping closer. You are sitting alone in this giant house, hoarding cash, while we are trying to build a life. We are your family. You are supposed to help us. I did help you. I gave you a very generous check, I replied, setting my teacup down. But you decided that wasn't enough. You decided my home, my savings, and my credit line belonged to you. You are mistaken. Mark finally stepped forward, placing a hand on his wife's arm. Mom, please. We just wanted the backyard to look nice. We can pay you back monthly. There is nothing to pay back, because the transaction was declined. I looked at my son, feeling a profound sense of disappointment. I am not your bank, Mark, and I will not be treated like an inconvenience that happens to have a checkbook. I stood up and walked over to the hallway console table. Stephanie, give me the spare key to this house. The one I gave Mark for emergencies. Stephanie crossed her arms, jutting her chin out. No. What if you fall and get hurt? You need us. She thought keeping the key meant she still had leverage. She underestimated me. I didn't argue with her over the key. I simply opened the front door and waited for them to leave. Stephanie stormed out, dragging Mark behind her, shouting over her shoulder about how I would regret cutting off my only family. The moment their taillights disappeared down the street, I called a local locksmith. Within 2 hours, every exterior lock on my house had been changed to a high-security deadbolt. Her holding on to that old piece of metal meant absolutely nothing now. The next morning, I went into my garage. Over the past year, Mark and Stephanie had used my garage as a free storage unit for boxes of old college textbooks, winter coats, and ugly home decor they didn't want in their pristine new house. I spent the morning loading every single box into the trunk and back seat of my car. I drove to their new house one last time. Mark's car was in the driveway. I carried the boxes to the front porch, stacking them neatly by the door. For the final touch, I took out a small, beautifully wrapped gift box. Inside, I placed the cut-up pieces of the canceled credit card, the old spare key they had refused to return, and a printed list of local self-storage facilities. I rang the doorbell, set the little box on top of the stack, and walked back to my car. As I pulled out of the driveway, the front door opened. I saw Mark step out, looking at the tower of boxes. Then, I heard him shout, not at me, but back into the house, at his wife. The illusion of their perfect arrangement had finally cracked. 6 months have passed since I dropped those boxes. On their porch, I never received an apology from Stephanie, and I never expected one. People who view others solely as resources rarely apologize when the ATM gets shut down. They just get angry that the machine is broken. Mark comes over once a month for Sunday coffee. He comes alone. We don't talk about his finances. And we certainly don't talk about his wife. The first time he visited, He tried to bring up the patio furniture, hinting that Stephanie was still upset. I simply stood up, took his coffee mug, and told him the visit was over. He hasn't crossed that boundary again. He knows I will enforce it immediately. I used a small fraction of my savings to hire a landscaping service. Now, instead of worrying about my money being drained by greedy relatives, I spend my afternoons sitting on my own back patio, surrounded by blooming hydrangeas and perfectly trimmed hedges. My home is quiet, my bank accounts are secure, and my mind is completely at peace. I don't feel guilty. I don't feel like a bad mother. I feel like a woman who survived a lifetime of hard work and finally learned how to protect the fruits of her labor. Giving them that housewarming gift was the best mistake I ever made. It showed me exactly who they were, before they could take everything I had. And the peace I have now. That's something money truly cannot buy. The biggest lesson I took from all of this isn't just about protecting money. It's about protecting your peace. We often tolerate disrespect because we're afraid of ruining the family image, or we think arguing will eventually make the other person understand. But I learned that you don't need to scream, explain yourself endlessly, or wait for an apology from someone who feels entitled to your life. Sometimes, the most powerful response to manipulation is simply a quiet no and a changed lock. Setting boundaries isn't an act of anger. It's an act of self-preservation. When people show you that they view you as a resource rather than a human being, the best thing you can do is politely, but firmly, remove their access to you.